The Technical AI Safety Podcast is supported by the Center for Enabling Effective Altruist Learning and Research, or CLR. CLR, known to some as the EA Hotel, is a nonprofit focused on alleviating bottlenecks to desk work in the effective altruist community. Learn more at clr.org. That's CEEALAR.org. Optimal Policies Tend to Seek Power by Alexander Matt Turner, Logan Smith, Rohin Shah, Andrew Critch, and Prasad Tadepalli. Abstract. Some researchers have speculated that capable reinforcement learning agents are often incentivized to seek resources and power in pursuit of their objectives. While seeking power in order to optimize a misspecified objective, agents might be incentivized to behave in undesirable ways, including rationally preventing deactivation and correction. Others have voiced skepticism. Human power-seeking instincts seem idiosyncratic, and these urges need not be present in reinforcement learning agents. We formalize a notion of power within the context of Markov decision processes. With respect to a class of neural reward function distributions, we provided sufficient conditions for when optimal policies tend to seek power over the environment. Alexander Matt Turner is an AI alignment researcher and fifth-year PhD student at Oregon State University. He is currently supported by a fellowship from the Center for Effective Altruism's Long-Term Future Fund. For the last 3 summers, he interned at the Center for Human Compatible AI at UC Berkeley. On Less Wrong, he goes by the name Turntrout. Alex, thanks so much for coming on to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So this is really interesting work. You provide formalisms for ideas that we talk about a lot in AI safety. So what's the TLDR on the paper or even just the abstract?
The TLDR is, for a while, we've had vague notions of the dangerousness of the danger of giving an expected utility maximizer some generic utility function, having it compute an optimal policy and follow it. So basically, the idea of AI will take over the world by default, I think, has been in the consciousness of the AI alignment community for quite a while. This work aims to formalize this intuition in terms of Markov decision processes. And on the way, like you mentioned, formalized notions like power, robust instrumentality, or what's been previously called instrumental convergence. And talking about when do these two things go together? When do AI policies tend to take over the world under certain assumptions?
Awesome. So this is largely a math paper. It's theoretical. There's no experiments. There's no Python. We'll get more into depth about this later, but could you briefly explain what you see as the value of that whole family of, theoretical RL work?
Right. I think the most important part is having these new formalisms for the concepts which you mentioned, like power. I think having these formalisms has helped me think more clearly about the broader alignment problem. I think there's the obvious specific value of being able to respond to some critiques, which are somewhat legitimate, of the kind of hand-waviness of some original arguments for AI risk. At the time I was working on this in the summer of 2019, and I was getting somewhat close to some of the key results, there was actually a debate published between Stuart Russell, Yoshio Bengio, Jan LeCun, some others, who's on the prestigious venue of Facebook, actually. There was a debate about instrumental convergence, and there was an article in Scientific American that was written by Jan and I think Tony Zador, talking about how it was anthropomorphizing to expect AI to take over the world because they didn't need to evolve power-seeking instincts. So there was this additional value at the time of wanting to reply to this and say, well, actually we can formalize this and show that, no, it does arise from the structure of the environment and what it means to pursue goals in that environment. So I see that as valuable. I'm not sure whether that will actually end up getting brought to attention in those debates, but that's one of my hopes as well. clearing up that discourse.
So yeah, deconfusing debates is definitely valuable on its face, I think. I hope participants in that debate would see this formalism and see they can think clearly about it. So we should start with instrumental convergence from Bostrom. The original idea back whenever it was published, at least Superintelligence 2014. I know it goes back further, but instrumental convergence in Superintelligence, the book, is just the idea that there's a class of goals that emerge as intermediate goals under a vast array of other goals. So you touched on this already, but is there anything else you want to say about what was unsatisfying to you about the literature on this?
Well, I don't think there was much literature on it to be unsatisfied with. There was a paper from Miri, I think in about 2014, 2015, formalizing convergent instrumental goals, I believe. And it made some modeling assumptions that assumed the agent had some featurized utility function over resource quadrants of the universe, basically, and showed that indifference to the resource availability from a specific part of the world was very unlikely, if I recall correctly. And it seemed to me like, yes, this is a model that might be appropriate for thinking about certain kinds of utility functions, but there's many ways that we might build AI, AGI. My paper doesn't quantify overall ways we might build AI, but I think it's broader than this initial modeling assumption of the agent has a goal that depends on resources. Like resources are this black box that the agent just cares about. Whereas we start from just the agent has an unstructured objective function over some Markov decision process. What tends to happen? So I think this is further down in terms of making fewer assumptions, which I think makes the conclusions stronger. Besides that paper, I don't think there was much else. There's, I think, a lot of informal discussion, but not much grounding out of the terms involved.
Mm-hmm. So there's no notion of resources here. Not really.
Right. There's no notion of resources assumed in this work. I think you can actually understand resources as, parts of the world that robustly kind of increase your power across some distribution of situations you're likely to run into here on planet Earth. Whereas it also helps you understand that if you're in Alpha Centauri and you have some green slips of paper, if you're on your own, that's not really going to help you steer the future the way you want. And so money wouldn't empower you in a different part of the state space. So I think this is one conclusion that you can draw from this work, and that helps you think about resources from more reductionistic point of view.
Fantastic. So you mentioned MIRI, which is the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. Just wanted to say that for anybody who doesn't know, who had this paper that you referenced. I also want to step back a little bit and talk about intermediate goals and terminal goals, just to be abundantly clear for our listeners. By intermediate goals, we usually mean something like grabbing car keys, and when what you really want to do is eat chocolate. It's not that you're intrinsically interested in the keys in hand state, but you are intrinsically interested in the eating chocolate state. So you compute the desire to grab keys from a vision of yourself driving to the store to buy chocolate. So in this example, we call grabbing the keys an instrumental value, and we call eating chocolate a terminal value. So just like really kind of philosophically on this, one thing I struggle with sometimes is that I call it either like an infinite regress or a limit kind of problem, where I can almost always think of some further goal to which what I initially thought was a terminal value is actually instrumental. So an example here is that eating chocolate is really instrumental to obtaining dopamine. I just feel like I don't have like a crisp like classifier that reliably sorts out what's instrumental and what's terminal. So in your reframing of robust instrumentality, do you see this making any sense?
Yeah, I think that this notion of optimality probability, which we'll get to later, kind of untangles this mess. So to frame things, we have a notion of certain actions being instrumental for a goal because they help you achieve that goal. Like you said, driving to the store is instrumental for eating chocolate. Additionally, you might have some actions which are instrumental for a wide range of different goals you might have. In the literature on AI alignment, this might be something like avoiding shutdown or not dying, right? This is helpful for a lot of goals. The first thing to notice here is that when we say something is helpful for a goal, it could be helpful because, it puts you in a better position, it sets you up to do well later, terminally, or because it does give you immediately the actual thing you want, the terminal thing. So I think under this ontology or framework, this is the terminal goals are a subset of the instrumental goals, technically speaking, according to this way of looking at here's what an instrumental subgoal is. In the paper, the way we look at things is there's certain plans you could execute, and you give with respect to some distribution over goals you might have, there's a certain probability that the plan is optimal. In particular, you learn you're at some state, right? You're outside your car, thinking about whether you want to drive to the store or not. And so you've got some distribution over goals, and it might be the case that with a high probability, driving to the store is optimal. Right? Now, it might be because you really like driving somehow, in which case I think you're kind of weird. But it might also be because you want something from the store. It doesn't distinguish between these two things. And so you can look at optimality probability as just avoiding this issue entirely.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Well, I'm looking forward to getting deeper into it over the next questions. So one more thing before I dive into the paper is this where you drew your definition of power from. The quote from the paper I have is, you quantify an agent's power as its ability to achieve goals in general. And this definition comes from the dispositional school of thought, the so-called dispositional school of thought on what power is. Could you say more about what some of the other definitions that may have been options and why you chose this one?
Sure. So apparently there's a couple schools of thought on what is philosophically, what do we mean by power when we talk about power in everyday speech? There's millions of papers by philosophers on this, of course. There's a couple perspectives. The dispositional perspective that you mentioned is power is your ability to achieve goals in general, as you said. And so dispositionally, power is like a capacity or an ability to bring about different outcomes. There's also an episodic notion, which is more like it's more talking about a relationship between two actors. So it might be episodic power where I'm coercing someone or incentivizing someone to do something, and because I might have the power to incentivize them to do different things, is my understanding. As to why I chose this dispositional school of thought, well, I think that implies a rather flattering view of how the research process generally works. But in this case, it was more like in 2018, I'd read a paper which talked about how great it was to think about power in terms of the ability to achieve goals in general. It drew on some linguistic evidence for this dispositional point of view, for it being about your ability to do things, by pointing out that power is translated into many languages as you've got pouvoir in French, which is like to be able to, and also it means power, like the noun. You've got like dekiru in Japanese, which I'm less confident about, but I think that there's many languages which have a similar connotation and linguistic assignment. So I thought, gee, this is compelling. I'll use this frame for now. And then over time, as I was building up some theorems about how these MDPs are structured, I started to realize maybe I can prove that instrumental convergence occurs in certain conditions. And so I used that definition of power, and then later, when I was doing my lit review, I found out, yes, there are many confusing philosophical papers on power. And this happens to line up with a previous school of thought, which I think is good, because it means it's evidence that I'm not just inventing convenient definitions that help me prove the theorem I want.
Right. Yeah. Cool. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're talking about rewardless MDPs. The Markov decision processes are modified so that they don't have a fixed reward function. And the reason for this is we're taking expectations over reward functions and we're quantifying over reward functions. We want to say for all reward functions, blah, 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 later on. So is that the basic reason behind rewardless MDPs? Where environment is fixed, but like reward is not?
Right. That's why I selected the rewardless MDP. I think more broadly, it's kind of a mistake for MDPs to include a discount rate and a reward function by default, because a Markov decision process, it's like a statistical process, and at each state you can choose a different action which essentially enforces a different transition matrix, right? And you can induce different Markov chains depending on your policy in the MDP, right? But then a reward function and discount rate are ways of grading the different Markov chains you induce. So it seems to me like MDPs just should not have a reward or even a discount rate. In terms of the theory of rewardless MDPs, it seems to me that there are theorems that people often use rewardless MDPs to prove. I haven't really found a very satisfactory theory that kind of just analyzes the properties of MDPs and their structure. There is, I think, a quite surprising theoretical gap with respect to rewardless MDPs, and in particular these visit distribution functions, which we'll be talking about soon.
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome, because the MDP, there's this sort of like agent environment problem where the agent ends and the environment begins. And like when you put I feel like the discount rate is like speaks about how the agent reasons, and like it's not like a facet of the environment, right? So like it's a little bit incoherent to say that the gamma is a parameter of the MDP instead of a parameter of the agent.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So rewardless MDPs goes further. It says that the reward function itself shouldn't be a parameter in the MDP. Although unlike the gamma case, it's not like the reward function's a parameter of the agent.
I mean, I suppose it's just depends on how you view. It's like the agent internally grading things or the environment grading what the states. I mean, I think you'll observe the same things under each model. It's kind of just a philosophical shift, I think.
All right, so what's like the outline of the paper? I know we're going to formalize power, and there's all these basic facets that we need in place in order to do that. And then, so just overview for us, how are we going to get those pieces in place? And then what are we going to do with power once we formalize it?
Right. There's two key notions we want to lock in. The first, like you said, is power. What does it mean for an agent to have a high or low degree of power at a certain state? And then second, we want to understand how to analyze the broad strokes incentives of some distribution over reward functions in a given environment. We want to understand the optimality probability of different actions and different trajectories, so to speak, with respect to this distribution. So if you're looking at the environment, you want to say, well, given this distribution, I think most agents are going to go to the store, for example, and they're not going to stay home because most of them do value eating chocolate, for example. And so this gives us a formal language. We're talking about the broad strokes incentives of these different reward functions. So third, we're going to combine these two notions of power and of optimality probability to talk about when optimal policies tend to seek power by navigating the states which have a high degree of formal power. And when is it true that most reward functions incentivize this? And so the third part will combine these two notions and then give sufficient conditions for when these two things go hand in hand, power seeking and robust instrumentality or a large optimality probability for that power seeking course of action.
I see. Fantastic. So yeah, let's dive in. Right. So the visit distribution. So the visit distribution, it's a really important item. For all policies pi and states S, it's the time discounted expectation of what state you'll land in if you follow pi from S. So to be concrete, it's a vector. It consumes a discount rate and produces a vector because it's a function. And I noticed states seem most usefully represented as unit vectors, like indicators or one-hot encodings. So we'll call this visit distribution f of pi at s. It's in the paper. It's with superscripts, and basically the optimal value function with these visit distribution functions is the max over all pi of a dot product, where it's dot product with f of pi at s of gamma and the vector representation of the reward function. So, am I correct?
Yeah, this is correct. Basically, the optimal value function for a reward function, you're starting at a state, and you've got some discount rate, and it tells you, what's the maximum on policy value you can get for this reward function starting from the state. Then there's the well-known dual formulation using these state visit distributions that instead just represents the consequences of each policy as the visit distribution. So it's just what's the distribution over future states you're visiting under this policy, dot product, how good are each of these states, the reward function. In particular, though, the reason we want to talk about visit distributions here is that they're like distributions over trajectories. The environment might not be deterministic. These policies we assume to be deterministic because there's always a deterministic optimal policy. But we really want to talk about some generalized notion of what are the options available to the agent at each state. And that's what these state visit distributions let you do.
Awesome. So if I'm representing a reward function as a vector, does that happen to what kind of vector does that form? Is that does it form a unit vector somehow, or is it like an indicator? Is it like a one hot encoding of some kind? Maybe not one hot, but like an encoding, or is it like an arbitrary vector?
It's just an arbitrary vector.
So with state visit distributions defined, we can basically talk about the basic properties of power. So first, we need the average optimal value, which is the expectation over reward functions of optimal value. Where again, optimal value was just the max of the dot product, max over pi. What's the significance of reward being independent and identically distributed across states?
So when we're defining this notion of average optimal value, it has to be an average over some distribution. In our case, the average is over some bounded reward function distribution. We define the notion of average optimal value. So this is just telling you, on average, how well can you do starting in this state at this discount rate with respect to this distribution? How well can you achieve these goals in general? Now, we want to analyze the IID situation where each state has a quote-unquote fair shot. Each state has the same state reward distribution, right? Instead of having a situation like, well, I'm going to make the reward distribution always apply 1 million reward to getting in a car crash and 0 reward to eating chocolate. And therefore, it's robustly instrumental to die as fast as you can. This is a little unsatisfying and contrived because you can kind of change the distribution to get whatever conclusion you want. So we want to restrict ourselves, and we do this by assuming that reward is IID and then just bounded for technical reasons and continues for technical convenience. For example, this also admits the maximum entropy distribution over reward functions, where each state has a reward drawn from unit 0, 1.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I think on its face, I think you're right that the IID thing prevents us from these contrived scenarios. So that's really clever. Just a small clarification about that. The set X is any continuous distribution, but the reward functions S into X are IID. So just can you briefly clarify how that works?
Right. This is just notation. It's just saying you've got some continuous bounded distribution over real numbers, and then you product it, number of states times. So you have one draw from X for each state. And then this forms a distribution over reward functions.
How do you want to describe the power formalism in English?
In English, the key chunk of the final power formalism we settle on is taking this average optimal value, this average ability to achieve goals drawn from this distribution, and renormalizing it so that it doesn't diverge as the discount rate approaches 1, because the return for each reward function can grow unboundedly, as it can grow as 1 over 1 minus gamma. So we just want to renormalize this so the power of the agent is a nice number right between 0 and 1. We do this by just essentially multiplying by 1 minus gamma times the average optimal value. There's a couple other tweaks we make as well, but they're not super important for what we're talking about right
now. Okay, cool. And there are various desiderata here. There's 2 notions of lower bound and 1 notion of upper bound. I feel like I'm slightly confused about the idea that if one must wait, one has less control over the future. So the idea that if one must wait, one has less control over the future is to motivate the idea that lower bound of current power is based on future power. Doesn't this imply that power can only decrease over time? And this just doesn't seem right to me. And so what am I missing?
Right. I think you've got something very important, although I'm not sure I would have seen it in this result. First of all, the notion of having to wait, decreasing your power, is basically saying for the first n time steps, you're locked into some default course of action, and you can't change this course of action, according to your reward function, right? So you've lost control over some initial portion of the future. So I think it makes sense that this decreases your power. It implies that, however, that when gamma is less than 1, you can gain power predictably just by waiting, for example, right? If you're in a waiting room, and we all know how waiting rooms work, you have to wait 1 million hours before you can do the thing you came there to do, like talk with your doctor. and not having any other ways to get out or any other options available, things you can do in the meantime, it will mean that by waiting, you get closer and closer to the point in time where you can exercise control over the future again. So power can
increase. Focuses you. Power can increase, and waiting sort of focuses you. Waiting sort of like constrains your next move.
Right. In this case, waiting is in the deterministic setting is just having to sit. You only have one real option available for the next n time steps. You don't have any choice or say over what state you visit for n time steps. And so then there's a result that gives a formula for power in that setting and shows that it does decrease compared to future power you'll get when you're done waiting. One of the important things here, though, is this notion of how power changes with the discount rate. And so if you have to wait a time step, and then you can choose between 3 states and then stay there forever, right? You've got an initial segment of lower power, but this initial segment, as you care more and more about the future, its influence vanishes, right? What really ends up mattering is how good is the final state you end up in. If you have a choice between 3 different final states, you're distributing reward according to the uniform distribution, then your expected value of this is just the expected maximum of 3 draws from the uniform distribution, which is 3/4. If you have 2 choices, it's going to be 2/3, and so on. And so this notion of power gives you a nice idea of how does adding a couple more options increase my expected optimal value. There's one last point to make, which is that when gamma equals 1, no action the agent takes will predictably increase its power, but there are some actions which will predictably decrease it. This is a bit of a thorny issue, which stems from the fact that we're assuming that the agent is optimal. In one of the appendices, I weaken this assumption and show what happens and how you can understand power in a more natural sense. If you assume that the agent's optimal, I would say something like, well, you as an optimal agent have the power, right? Like you've got power accorded to you by your ability to win the lottery whenever you please. All you have to do is choose a policy which writes down the correct number, right? But this is pretty unrealistic. So when you aren't optimal, you can expect to gain power by either improving your policies in general, getting smarter, or by navigating to states which have more easily accessible opportunities. Again, this is just a brief summary. The appendix really goes into detail, and I don't want to take too long on this.
In the appendix, great. So I feel there's this really I'm starting to understand the connection between power and optimality. I was going to talk about this later, but I could also bring it up now. Is what's the I feel like there's this important relationship between power and freedom, where number of options that you have is a factor in power. So is there any high level takeaway about the relation between freedom as in number of options and power?
I think there are often relationships here. I don't know that there's a general relationship. There's a notion that some listeners might be thinking about right now, which is information theoretic empowerment. Information theoretic empowerment of a state for a given horizon is basically saying, well, what potentially mixed or stochastic policy will maximize the mutual information between your distribution over actions and the distribution over states you end up seeing in n time steps. So in a sense, in a deterministic environment, it's quantifying how many states could you reach in n time steps. There's a couple reasons we didn't use it for this work. I think that the language of information theory just isn't that great of a fit for RL. This is phrased in terms in terms of optimal value functions, so it's very natural. But also, there's some specific edge case I could point out with empowerment, and about how empowerment will return counterintuitive answers or diverge as its horizon goes to infinity. And there's ways to repair it, but basically I feel like it's not that natural. So empowerment does capture this notion of freedom if you define it in terms of how many things can I make happen within n time steps or at n time steps from that. And this is sometimes, but not always, directly in agreement with power. Sometimes there's some kind of trade-offs you have to make. Or like maybe you could fully determine it where you end up in one time step, or you could fully determine where you end up in two time steps, but not both. And so it diverges sometimes. And for more on that, see Appendix A.
Cool. Awesome. So let's move on to how discounting affects the optimal policy set. So we have the idea of optimal policy shift. Do you want to explain that in English? What shift is?
Right. In English, imagine that you care about eating candy and only about eating candy, and you have a low geometric discount rate. Your time preference is heavily incentivized, just greedily getting as much candy as you can. Right? And so if you're in a building, you've got some candy next to you, right? Maybe the building's about to blow up. Why not? So if you're greedy, you're going to eat the candy right away, as opposed to maybe going out the building and driving to an abandoned warehouse that's full of candy. Even though in the long run, you'd eat more candy that way, right? When your time preferences are sufficiently myopic and you only care really about what happens in the next couple time steps, you're going to prioritize immediate reward. But there's a discount rate at which this changes. And you change your mind and say, actually, it makes more sense. It's better. I'll get more value by going to the store or going to the warehouse and eating the candy there. So this is just when your optimal policy set changes at a certain gamma value or at a certain discount rate. And an optimal policy shift occurs at a discount rate if the optimal policy set before the discount rate or below that discount rate value is not equal to your optimal policy set at that discount rate value.
Yeah. So there's the discontinuity is how that's formalized. Right. And that makes sense. I feel like I have a good intuition of that. So we're setting up optimality probability.
Right.
So what's optimality probability in English?
The optimality probability of an action is just the chance that the action is optimal at that state for reward functions drawn from your distribution. So again, the optimality probability of driving to the store to get chocolate might be high according to certain distributions you have over goals, because a lot of the goals have the get in the car action as an optimal action at your state.
Right. So a lot of goals like converge on driving. I guess I'm missing. I guess maybe I just need to hear it one more time, but I'm missing how like information about like reward functions like create these intermediate goals under a lot of intermediate goals. Or maybe does that spur anything? Or was that incoherent?
Well, one response I might have is forget about the intermediate goals for now. Just think in terms of optimality probability. So without trying to classify whether an action is usually taken because it's intermediate or because it's terminal, just think about what's the chance that this is optimal. Does that help?
Okay. Yeah, it does. Great. And do you need to say anything about gain optimal?
So gain optimality is basically maximizing your average per time step reward. So instead of caring more about stuff that'll happen soon and less about stuff that'll happen later when you're geometrically discounting, you can say, I want to maximize my average reward in the limit of, infinitely many time steps. And that is gain optimality, as coined in the literature.
Right.
And so this will become relevant when we're talking about discount rates that are very close to 1 or are at 1.
So we have this idea of transferring optimal policy sets across discount rates. So what's going on there? Right.
As we head into this formalism of the broad strokes incentives of reward function distribution, we want to talk about how do these incentives change with respect to the discount rate. To do this, we have to fill in some holes in the MDP theory about what happens when you change a discount rate for a fixed reward function. And so first, we have this notion of optimal policies can depend on how much you care about the future. There's an interesting result we have here that says if you have one optimal policy set for some reward function and some discount rate gamma, you can, for any other discount rate, you can make a new reward function that has the same optimal policy set at that different discount rate. And so basically, you can, in a sense, transfer or carry over optimality incentives from one discount rate to another. This is just playing on a broader theme of, here's this structure of the environment, this rewardless MDP. What happens when we vary the discount rate with respect to a fixed reward function distribution? How does that change the incentives? And this theorem I'm pretty happy with because it's a nice little piece of that puzzle that helps us understand what does happen when we do that.
So the next important thing is action optimality probability. So what's going on there?
We want to talk about, at a given discount rate, we've got this distribution again, in this setting, at a given state, how probable is it that any given action is optimal? To go back to this car example that we love so much, right? You're sitting outside your car, and you've got some set of options or actions available to you. We can formally quantify the probability that any given action is taken by an optimal policy for these reward functions drawn from this distribution. It's like, what's the probability that for these reward functions, this can be an optimal thing to do? The nice thing about this is that it formalizes the intuition behind this robust instrumentality or instrumental convergence thesis. The idea that some actions are just good for a wide range of goals. The idea that some actions are just optimal for a wide range of goals.
Okay, got it. So the probability that something is optimal, so for example, I might have attempted to formalize robust instrumentality as the statistical significance of like co-occurring subgoals. So under how many goals does subgoal A occur? Like that's like a first guess, right? At just something that like came to mind for me.
Right.
Now the probability that something is optimal compares to that by like I guess I'm not sure how it would compare to that intuition.
I think it's a special case where the subgoal is just taking that action. You could also, if you want like farther out subgoals in the state space, like things that are more than one time step removed from you. Like if I want to talk about subgoals that might have in the middle of driving across the country on the highway, then you could, in fact, take these visit distributions and take the subset of them which satisfy the sub-goal, right? So the subset of them which represent the sub-goal in question, which follow it, or meet it. So like the visit distributions induced by policies which pull over to get gas while driving on the interstate, right? This would be a coherent thing to do. And so you could also ground this out in terms of our next definition, which is about the optimality probability of a visit distribution, or a set of visit distributions. So yeah, I think there's multiple ways you can tie that in.
I think we have a pretty good notion of power. And I would just, power really is, power is the probability of optimality.
Power is the probability of optimality?
That's as best I can simplify it right now. According to how I have absorbed things and retained things so far.
I definitely thought at first that power and optimality probability should go hand in hand. And this is not true.
Yeah, could you say more about that process of coming to understand that?
This was one of the last insights I had before kind of 1.0 of this paper. I've been grappling with this from the summer of 2019 into early 2020 before I came up with, I think, satisfactory understanding of how this actually isn't true. There's a notion of power-seeking actions that I want to talk about first. An action, taking an action at a given state will give you an expected power for that action. So it's the power you expect to end up with after having taken the action. So one action seeks more power than another if it has a greater expected power for the successive states. Now, I had thought that power-seeking actions are basically always more likely to be optimal than non-power actions which seek less power. And this turns out not to be true, even in an intuitive sense, not even relying on my power formalism in particular. So in this paper, in figure 7, we have this MVP where you can go left and go up and get stuck immediately in a terminal state, or you can go to the right and you'll have one future choice to make before you end up in a terminal state. And it turns out that even when you restrict reward functions to being IID, there's still a distribution for which it's robustly instrumental to go up. Under this distribution, which is the quadratic state reward distribution, so every reward is drawn from the f of x equals x squared quadratic distribution. It's still IID. Every state gets the fair shake, the same reward distribution. But in this case, going up and getting stuck and having no future choices is that discount rate gamma equals 0.12. It has about a 91% chance of being optimal, even though going right is not only power-seeking from my definition, it's intuitively power-seeking, right? Any reasonable notion of power, given a choice between being stuck and having no influence over the future, or having one future choice, has to say that the latter is more powerful, right? And so this really just, I guess, blows up the idea that even in the IID setting, this is going to work.
So there's a study of which discount rates make these kind of pathological behaviors happen.
I suppose there might be a study of that. It's not necessarily one I've conducted yet. Instead of trying to show, well, for all IID distributions, you're always going to have power-seeking actions have a greater chance of being optimal, right? That's just not true. So instead, you can have sufficient conditions for this being true for all IID reward distributions.
Right.
And that's what we focus on.
Right.
And so now we're moving into that third part I
Okay.
mentioned before, where we take these two notions of optimality probability of an action or of a set of, I guess, these quote-unquote trajectories or state visit distributions, right? The probability that that object is optimal, and also the notion of power seeking, we combine them to give sufficient conditions for when the two go together.
I want to talk about this this idea of tending, because now we're at the point where the claim of the paper is clarified. So I have a quote. When we claim that optimal policies tend to seek power, tend serves two purposes. We claim that the MDP structure tends to be such that optimal policies tend to seek power under a distribution.
Right.
Right? So what's going on here is we have these edge cases where optimal policies are not power seeking.
Yeah, do not tend to be power seeking. Exactly.
So those edge cases, is it to you a area of research to like come to a description of those edge cases or like find predicates over those edge cases?
Yeah, this is still something which confuses me. I don't know how to characterize the edge cases. I guess if you had a characterization of the edge cases, you would also be able to decide when something wasn't an edge case, which would violate this theorem that says you can't just look at the graph and say whether it's an edge case without considering the specific different reward distributions. That said, one commonality I've noticed is this happens a lot when there's very fast, direct ways to reach your terminal goals, so to speak. So one example I give in my less wrong post is if you have some distribution over reward functions that reward you for reaching some random area on the Earth's surface, right? There's a bunch of different Earth surface reward functions, right? And to best achieve these, it might be robustly instrumental to go to the airport. Of course, if you have some kind of teleportation device or a private jet, then it's no longer robustly instrumental to go to the airport. Instead, you just go directly to where you want to go. And so, by having this direct means of accessing your terminal goals, it kind of cuts away the need to go to these high-power states. There's just a direct path to directly where you want to go, and then you're stuck there. So that's one thing I've noticed, but I think it is a very open area of research.
So a really important theorem here is retaining strictly more options is more probable under optimality and also power seeking. So can you at a high level talk about what's going on there?
The key insight for this theorem is if you imagine, again, you're looking down on the environment from a bird's eye view, you're looking at the graphical model in the deterministic setting, you can see that, maybe one action leads to, some subgraph, some small subgraph, and then another action leads to a really big subgraph. And in fact, you can graphically embed the small action subgraph into the big subgraph. Then the big subgraph gives you strictly more options. It's imagine that you can enter one of two rooms, and your reward functions just grade being in each room, right? There's one reward for being in one room, one reward for being in another. Now, the left room is just a single room, but the right room has two sub-rooms, each of which, again, have their own reward. And so if you go into the left sub-room, you're just stuck in that one room you went into. You go into the right room, you've got two choices. You could stay stuck in the first one, or you could go to the second one. So in some sense, you have strictly more options in the latter. And so this theorem 6.6, it formalizes this idea of having strictly more options in this graphical kind of sense. It implies both strictly greater optimality probability of that action but also that action being strictly power-seeking. This is really cool because this theorem holds for all discount rates.
So I feel like this result, it speaks again to the intuition that I want to bring up again, which is freedom, which is having more options and how that relates to power. Would you want to tie it into anything we said earlier about having more options as like a generic signal?
Right.
About
right,
power?
Because reward is IID, having more options, like all else equal, you expect to be better off, or to have more control over the future in the relevant sense of like, you're gonna, it's gonna help you increase your average optimal value. It's gonna help you increase your optimal value for more reward functions, so to speak. And so these proofs often do rely on a notion of you basically can do strictly more things in the relevant sense by doing A than by doing B.
So, Alex, what's the last part of this walkthrough?
The last part is examining what happens when the agent cares a lot about the future, when the discount rate is sufficiently close to 1. In this case, we can actually ignore all these transient dynamics, everything that happens along the way to your terminal state. You can ignore those entirely. And instead you can say, well, you can prove things like, well, if this course of action only gives me access to like one terminal state, right? Getting shut down. I have no more choices. I'm just stuck in the shutdown state. Or the wealth of other states I could reach if I don't get shut down. Then when gamma's close enough to 1, you can prove that it's like many, many times more probable that the agent avoids getting shut down. There's a much bigger chance that it's going to be optimal to go for one of these other terminal states. So this lets us give very nice numerical bounds on this optimality probability. And it, I think, illustrates via some pretty simple reasoning that shutdown is not have a very good chance of being optimal. That's a very particular outcome that the agent could choose to allow itself to enter. If it has other choices, especially a lot of other choices, then it's got a better chance that its highest reward terminal states don't lie in the single shutdown state. So theorem 6.9 generalizes this kind of reasoning to talk about arbitrary recurrent state distributions, which is just the fancy word for where do I end up on average in the limit of in the limit of infinitely many time steps. What's the final distribution over states I tend to cycle through, so to speak. So it's just a generalization of the notion of having a single terminal state. Maybe you're looping between a couple states, ping pong back and forth between two states. This theorem lets you talk about all those. And it says if one action gives you access to strictly more terminal states or strictly more recurrent state distributions than another action, then under certain conditions, it's both more probably optimal, more probable under optimality, and it's power seeking compared to that other action. So again, we're tying together these two notions of power seeking and having a greater probability of being optimal.
What would be some bottlenecks to implementation and empirical experiment? Or put it better, if you had a team of 10 software developers and $1 million of GPU, what would you do to advance this line of work empirically?
I don't know what I would do. I don't know, I don't know whether there's a ton of empirical clarification that's needed. One thing I'm curious about, but I'm not sure whether it would be tractable even in that situation without more theoretical insights, would be if you randomly generate these MDPs, right? And you randomly generate, you've got some joint distribution over MDPs, over your IID reward distribution, and over initial states, over discount rates, right? Under this joint distribution, how often are power-seeking actions have a greater chance to be optimal. How often do these two things go together generically? The title of the paper is about optimal policies tend to seek power. I suspect that if you randomly generate MDPs, randomly generated stochastic non-sparse MDPs are not what we're used to working with. And I think that would probably be the case that a lot of them just don't obey this relationship. But if you're thinking about the kind of MDPs, the distribution of MDPs that we actually think about when we're deploying agents and when we're, building simulations, I think these theorems are probably applicable. They're preconditions in that. And so I would be curious, with what probability do these two notions of power seeking and optimality probability go hand in hand with respect to this joint distribution? So I guess I would think, if I had those resources, I would think about it for a while to be sure, see if there weren't any really useful experiments to do, and if I couldn't come up with anything better, then I'd probably just send them over to work on whatever Paul Cristiano is working on with his more experiment-based agenda.
There's a small fortune of theorems and conjectures about this formalism. Are there any highlights you're particularly excited about that you'd like to draw attention to?
There's a couple different kinds of excitement I have. Intellectually, I'm pretty excited and curious about the answers to many of these conjectures, which are actually just a small subset of several dozen conjectures and additional results I've compiled elsewhere. I'm curious about this because it seems like it's just a gap in basic MDP theory, that it seems strange to me that I was inventing the notion of an optimal policy shift with the discount rate. There's various MDP representation theorems I have that talk about how you can encode a deterministic MDP with these visit distributions. And you can encode stochastic MDPs with the visit distribution functions. Lets you get a nice kind of isomorphism, etc. And so there's a lot of results I'm very excited about intellectually, and I'm curious about what their continuations are. In terms of relevance to alignment, I think a lot of these results are a lot of these conjectures are just slight extensions or relaxations of some of the preconditions of the main theorems. And so I'm curious to know the answers to them, but they're not necessarily the center of my future research.
Suppose there are two major flavors of research question derivation. In one flavor, you imagine how AGI goes horribly wrong and you think of something that will disrupt that story. In the other flavor, you imagine how AGI goes well and you think of what needs to be done to bring that about. In both cases, you do a sort of backward chaining. Does this line of work fit into either of those frameworks?
If I had to project this work onto one of those, I'd probably choose the former, which is finding a way that things go horribly wrong and figuring out how to avert it. I think this was a failure mode that had been pointed out a while back. What this work is investigating is this actually a failure mode? It's trying to investigate for what kinds of agents will this be true. And I don't think, it doesn't fully answer this question, right? We're not going to be using IID reward function distributions to reason about the agents we expect to deploy. But I think it's a start. And so I think it's a start of getting a better grasp of what kinds of training processes, what kinds of training signals lead to power-seeking agents. And so my hope is that this is the first step in many to understand that question, and thereby perhaps avert catastrophe by that avenue.
Right. So have you thought about like misapplications of this work, like villainous applications that might not be info hazards, so that you could speak about them now, but have you thought about like misuse or like?
Yeah, one of the first thoughts I had was, oh no, if I formalize power, now we know how to build maximally power-seeking agents. But I mean, really, I feel like this is probably just the default, so it's not like almost the default, right? Not maximally power-seeking, but I think my intuition is that things can be pretty bad on that front by default. So like actually knowing how to compute this isn't that much worse.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that like the ways, protagonists could use this work to from in a path to from now till the world being saved from bad AI, that would look like my first guess is it would look like, arguments that RL should be avoided. Is one direction that this could go in. Is actually saying like, like if you satisfy it's almost like satisfying some proof obligations that show that that RL is possibly just unwise in a generic way. Does that kind of make sense? Do you agree with that at all?
Yeah, I think like there's maybe some grown-up version of these results that would just like very strongly imply that. Right now, this assumes things like full observability, and if you want to model agents acting in the real world, you're going to need to use a POMDP, at least a partially observable MDP. And also, this is like analyzing the optimal policies, not the learned policies, which might in fact be quite different. But that said, I think this is another maybe knife in the back of just vanilla RL, which I think is not a good approach for online agents. In terms of
that's great.
In terms of a
go on.
Specific thing that the protagonist might use, a specific use case. One thing Andrew Critch is excited about is applying this framework, these formalisms, to better analyze and understand power dynamics, multi-agent systems. And I think I'm beginning to share this enthusiasm. The world, you can really view the world as a multi-agent system, the humans existing alongside the AIs. And so then questions are along the lines of what are the dynamics that arise from deploying these power-seeking agents? And when will they be seeking power at our expense, and how can we avoid that?
I guess in a multi-agent case, the first thing to think about isn't cooperation, but it's competition. And it's, if we go back to the resource angle, where we would apply these MDPs to an interpretation of resources, power seeking would lead to competition for resources, wouldn't it? And would it be a zero-sum game where multiple agents couldn't all be power seeking together? Or is there a positive sum way of doing it?
I think, yeah.
So let's say
that's an open question.
No, go ahead.
There's one insight here, which is that defection, game theoretic defection, and power seeking are not the same thing. This is the thing I thought about last summer. There's a lesson post I wrote called "What Counts as Defection," which proposes a formal criterion for when a strategy is defecting against another strategy profile. So this involves a notion of strict personal selfish gain, doing better on payoff for yourself at the expense of the weighted coalitional payoff you might have. So this could just be some payoff for everyone else. But the basic idea is you're taking things for yourself and violating some kind of agreement you might have had with the rest of the group. This is different from power seeking in somewhat fuzzy ways, but I think it's important to note that the distinction is there.
Wow. So, for example, if we were in a common pool resource dilemma, and let's say that we knew we were in a common pool resource dilemma, so we wouldn't want to bring about a tragedy of the commons. Essentially, let's say that we are forward thinking, we're thinking ahead enough that we recognize a shared interest in averting a tragedy of the commons outcome. And a way this could be interpreted in multi-agent RL is something I've been thinking of as inducing altruism, which is taking metrics about the global state of the multi-agent system. So fairness, equality, sustainability, and having individual agents like maximize those metrics. Just something I've been thinking about. Would power seeking make it better or make it harder or easier to induce cooperation in this way?
So the first issue is that power seeking isn't yet defined in multi-agent setting. I'm working with, I'm mentoring Jacob Stavrianos right now on building out a formal definition of power in a multi-agent setting. And so right now we're looking at formalizing this in the setting of Bayesian games, where essentially each player has strategies which take as input their type or their objective, and then maps it to some distribution over actions, right? And so you can imagine you've got, in the normal RL setting that we've been looking at, it's just an MVP. You're the only player. Your type distribution is just your reward function distribution. But here it's like a joint reward function distribution for many players. And I guess the bird's eye view of this is it allows other players to adapt their strategies and change the dynamics of the environment that you perceive depending on their goals. And so if they hate you and they're trying to screw you all the time, they're going to min-max against you as a coalition. So they collectively choose the strategy that minimizes your expected value for what they think your type is. And then conversely, if they're all trying to help you, they can all choose a maximally cooperative strategy for you. And so, your power in this sense could depend on the strategies of the other players as well. But this isn't fully nailed down yet. I still am somewhat confused about what exactly is power in a multi-agent setting, because so much depends on the strategy profile of the rest of the players.
That's At a high level, I feel like it's just positive sum or non-zero sum or zero sum. At a really high level, I feel like that's the bifurcation.
For power seeking? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, whether power is some quantity that can be that's out there in the world that can be played in a zero sum game or played as rewards in a non-zero sum game.
I don't know whether power is considered or not. So there's one distinction here, which is that when you think about the power of an agent, you're basically just applying some mental model you have for what the agent quote unquote could do. This is broken in a couple ways because there's only one thing that the agent actually will do, and so each agent's power is it's objectively subjective. It depends on your model for how they work, right? It's not like a physical fact. It might be a counterfactual fact according to some model of actions the agent is taking, right? But ultimately, we're bringing in some modeling assumptions about these agents. And so if you have multiple agents, I don't know. It seems kind of like a weird question to me, but it's also one I'm very interested in. It's in what situations will power seeking necessarily take power away from other players?
Yeah. Right. That seems like a very important question. That's exciting. So, a principle that I really like, back to the subject of how a research question is derived. A principle I really like is I won't attribute it because I don't know where exactly the person I think I heard it from said it, and I could have been synthesizing it from multiple sources, is the following. you should work on technical problems that cause you, in working on them, to think more clearly about social problems. In that spirit, is there a social problem that you think this work has made you think more clearly about?
I think it's fairly easy to take this formalism for power, and port it over into other domains like politics, political power, the power you have over a person. I think you can think about that pretty clearly as like if you restrict yourself to plans which rely on interfacing with that person, how high is your power? I think that's a pretty reasonable way of getting at it. And so like since you can take all these components of social problems and view them better through this frame, I feel like it has made it easier for me to think about multi-agent alignment problems, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In Andrew Critch's breakdown, there's like single multi, there's multi-single, there's single, different kinds of alignment, right? And it sounds like there are bits and pieces of each of those kinds of alignment that you can kind of like deconfuse a little bit by thinking about power in a formal way. I've
thought some about single using this. There's a post I have on non-obstruction as a concept which motivates corrigibility or being able to correct the AI we deploy, which I also wrote on Less Wrong. And I feel like this understanding power was crucial for understanding that single problem.
I should probably link in the show notes a TLDR of Andrew Critch's, taxonomy of the different alignment problems. So we've talked a bit about what's next for this line of work. Is there anything else you'd like to say about like what you're currently working on? Or
when I started off with this chunk of MDP theory, I was actually trying to understand the effectiveness of a method I proposed called the chamber utility preservation, which aims to mitigate the negative effects of giving an AI the wrong rewards function, and then it makes a big mess. It has a lot of side effects. Pieces, quote unquote, very confident that it was optimizing the correct goal. It just chose the best policy or a very good policy. And so you reward it for crossing the room, and it sprints across the room and breaks stuff because you forgot to penalize it for breaking stuff. So what's a fully general solution to that problem? And so I basically had an approach that worked well. It worked well by sampling random reward functions to use for its penalty term. I'm not going to get too much into that, but basically I didn't understand structurally how this could come about with my knowledge of MDP theory at the time. So I started building new MDP theory, and then this just turned into proving robust instrumentality in certain situations. I realized I could do that, but now I'm finally able to understand what's going on with this approach to some extent. And this work has given me the language to specify the right POMDP to say what's the problem that's being solved, and also show that a slight variant of the approach that I proposed solves that POMDP. So it's like this has given me a good vocabulary that I'm using right now to wrap up my PhD.
Awesome. Where can people find you if they want to keep an eye on this?
They can find me on lesswrong.com. My username's TurnTrout, no spaces, TURNTROUT, and that also should have my email as well.
Awesome. Any final words?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to have final words besides thanks for having me on. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, Alex, thanks for coming on the show. Music by Alex Kulik. Thumbnail image by Max Wild.